Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Martin Brazier, who's one of our senior consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today we're going to be talking about a forthcoming information access standard called the Social Tenant Access to Information Requirements, or STAIRs. So Martin, my first question for you is, what are the STAIRs and how did they come about?
Well, this is really intended to fill a gap. Social tenants of local authorities already have access to information about the properties they live in through the Freedom of Information Act. But this doesn't apply to private registered providers, so they don't have that right available to them. And they do have the right to make a data subject access request under the data protection law, but that will only give them their own personal data and nothing else. So the intention of the requirements is to plug that gap and allow tenants of private registered providers of social housing to obtain information about the management of the housing in which they live.
Great, thank you, Martin. So what will private registered providers have to do to comply with STAIRs?
Well, there are really only two broad requirements. The first one is that the private registered providers should publish information proactively via what's called a publication scheme. And the second requirement is that residents of those private registered providers and their representatives, so lawyers and the like, can request data about the management of their homes. And there's a various set standards of time periods for responses to those requests and so on. The Freedom of Information Act allows anybody anywhere to ask anything, and when responding to a Freedom of Information request, public authorities are not allowed to consider the motives behind the request or what the identity of the person asking is. This will be slightly different under the STAIRs because it limits the requesters to tenants and their representatives and limits the requestable information to information about the management of their housing. So that's a slight difference. It does have some boundaries around it. And regarding timescales, they've got to have a publication scheme in place by October 2026 and should be ready to handle information requests from April 2027, which sounds like a long way away, but that will creep up on people fairly quickly. There's more detail yet to emerge on the requirements over the coming months, such as what might be in the publication scheme and any exemptions that can be applied to information requests. But as I said, they're coming, so I think there's enough information out there for the private registered providers to begin to prepare.
And what's likely to be included in a publication scheme?
Well, as I said, that hasn't been detailed yet, but we've got a clue from how publication schemes work under the Freedom of Information Act. Originally, back in 2005, when the Act came into force, the Information Commissioner's Office required that every public authority provided a publication scheme for the ICO to approve. That very quickly became unmanageable because there were far too many and it placed an unrealistic burden on the ICO. So what they did was they devised a model publication scheme and a set of definition documents for each type of public body. So one for government bodies, one for local authorities, one for the police and so on, which details the sort of information that would be expected to appear in the publication scheme. And that falls into 6 or 7 broad categories. The first one is who we are and what we do. So what's the description of the organisation, the roles and responsibilities, the structure and so on. The second is what we spend and how we spend it. So that's budgets, financial statements, audit reports and so on. The third one is, what are our priorities and what are we doing? Well, that's obviously strategies, plans, performance figures, an annual report, perhaps service standards, that sort of thing. The fourth is how we make decisions, so the governance, consultation, board minutes, board papers, all of that sort of thing. The fifth one is policies and procedures. So that's policies on how they conduct business, how they deliver services, on pay and recruiting, customer service, on data protection. There's section 4, lists and registers. So that could be lists of assets or disclosure logs of requests for information, for example, gifts and hospitality, board members' interests, all that sort of thing. And finally, a list of the services offered by that public body. So from that, we can probably make a good guess at what is likely to be in a model publication scheme under STAIRS. So the first obvious one would be how the housing stock is managed, including any planned maintenance, any progress on environmental issues, any proposals to buy or sell or improve housing stock, and so on. That would also include the performance of the organisation, including the outcomes of inspections, ratings, evaluations, performance reports, tenant satisfaction survey results, health and safety performance, maintenance work, and all those sorts of elements of performance. They would also include a description of the housing services they provide, and also provide guidance for tenants as to how they can access those services and when they apply. Finance is there, include how the organisation spends its money, any grants they've received, how the service charge revenue is used, the governance of the organisation, the organisational structure, the leadership structure, how they make decisions, how they consult with tenants, and so on. And last of all, lists and registers and policies related to the management of social housing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. So if an organisation is a private registered provider, what should they be doing to prepare sort of now ahead of these requirements coming into force?
Well, first of all, you need to understand the requirements and how it applies to that particular organisation. A good idea, once you've done that, is to complete a gap analysis to identify the information that you hold that is within the scope of the publication scheme. And it's likely that you already will have published some information. So you could already, they could already be part way there. At this point, I think it's worth mentioning that there's no requirement under Freedom of Information, and it's likely to be the same under STAIRS, to create information that's been requested or is required under a publication scheme. So if somebody asks for some information and you don't have it, then you don't have to provide it. You're not required to create information or create information in a certain format to answer a request. The next thing is to start to prepare a publication scheme area on the website so that you can begin to add information early and move existing published information into a publication scheme. When it arrives, the model scheme has a certain number of set categories, create those categories and start to move information in early. The next thing would be to speak to the tenants and inform them of the new rights, when the rights will come into force, and the information that can be found on the publication scheme. The theory of publication schemes, including the one under Freedom of Information, is that people will go and look at that first and be able to find out information about the organisation before they make a request for information. That's not always the case, because it's really easy to write a one-line email to request information. So people don't always look at the publication scheme first. So it's really useful to point people to the information that's there first whenever you can. Also, it's a good idea to speak to any suppliers and contractors that work for the organisation, because they may hold information on behalf of the private landlords. If you are requested for that information, you will need their help to be able to get some of that information that they hold on your behalf to fulfill a request. And it's always handy to alert suppliers that the organisation is subject to those requirements, so that it doesn't come as a surprise to them. And if they're asked for information directly, what they should do and how they should liaise with you. In time, you will need to set up a process for answering requests for information. So that's likely to include an estimate of how many you might get. It's likely to be quite a lot in the first months of the requirements coming out, I would imagine. So what resources are you likely to need? How are you going to train your staff? Deciding on whether you need any particular request handling or case management software to help you manage them. You'll need to create a log to record the requests when they come in, when they were received, how and when they were answered, and so on. You'll need to devise a simple means for tenants to make requests, perhaps an online form, for example. Like the FOI, requesters are not obliged to use any particular means to request information, and certainly you can't refuse a request that's not made in a particular way. But any request has to be in writing to be valid. So if you receive a letter or an email, you've got to answer it. They don't have to use your form. If you do use a form, it can often streamline the process. You can create a process to identify tenants, because, of course, only tenants are allowed to make requests, not general members of the public. So you need to be able to identify them and ensure that the request is valid. You need to assess the information requested to determine whether it falls within the scope of the STAIRS requirements, or perhaps another information rights regulation, such as subject access request under data protection law. So, for example, if somebody makes a request under STAIRS and it's actually asking for their personal data, you've got to treat that as a subject access request, not a request under STAIRS. You should create a process to make sure you've contacted all your suppliers and contractors to obtain any information that they hold on your behalf and to track their responses. The process has also got to determine a standard appropriate response, because when the final details of STAIRS come out, there may be some general information that you have to provide, such as how to complain if people aren't happy. And also, as and when the exemptions emerge, you may have to have some standard wording to be able to articulate why a request has been refused. We don't know what the exemptions are going to be like yet, but under the Freedom of Information, there are fairly standard ones, such as the information's already published. So, they can go and find it for themselves, that it comprises the personal data of somebody else, for example. So there's an exemption for that. It could be a matter of commercial interest for the organisation, and so on. But we don't yet know exactly how those exemptions are going to work. It's also useful to make a decision on the format for providing the information, so it's accessible to all requesters. It's no good providing information in a obscure digital format that nobody will have the software to read. And of course, we've got to consider people who may have disabilities and so on, that as to how we provide that information. A standard template is a good idea for answering requests to make sure that a compliant response is made, and it includes all the information you're required to. And again, we mentioned complaints. There will need to be a process in place if people aren't happy with the answer that you've given them.
Amazing, thank you, Martin. It sounds like there's plenty that organisations could be doing now to get ready for when STAIRS comes into force. So just to wrap us up, do you sort of have any final thoughts on this that you could share with us?
Yeah, there's still some time before the standard comes into force, but the experience of most public bodies with freedom of information was most did nothing until the last month, and then had a blind panic on how to get in place. The good news is that a lot of these bodies will already have much of the information required to go into the publication scheme, for example. So it may not be as large a burden as they think. So use the time that you've got to start to pull some of that together, and you can make some really large steps early on. So that will allow the organisation to lay the groundwork for a smooth and seamless implementation when it comes, and when further details become available, it will just avoid any last-minute pressures and reduce the risk of non-compliance. And as always, if you need help, go out and find it early.
Thank you very much, Martin. And for any of our listeners that want to read up on this topic, we've got a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called Getting Ready for the Social Tenant Access to Information Requirements. So do go and give that a read, and thank you for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.